A single book pulled Europe from intellectual darkness into the light of modern science. This is the story of a fragile manuscript that survived against all odds, a lone spark that ignited the European Renaissance. By the end of this journey, you will understand exactly how one collection of pages shattered an entire worldview and set the stage for scientific giants like Copernicus and Galileo. We will trace its incredible journey from the East, uncover the revolutionary ideas hidden within its text, and explore why a single artifact could challenge centuries of established belief. How does a society begin to question everything it thought it knew? The intellectual landscape of medieval Europe was one of deep shadows and closed doors. For centuries, the towering authorities of Aristotle and Ptolemy had defined the boundaries of all knowledge. Their ideas about the natural world, from the elements composing matter to the celestial spheres holding the planets, were treated as near-sacred texts. Yet these classical works were not studied in their original, complex forms. Instead, they were absorbed through a dense filter of theological commentary, where the primary goal was not to question or observe, but to reconcile ancient philosophy with the doctrines of the Church. A university scholar of the time would spend his days mastering logic and rhetoric, debating the finer points of ancient texts in lecture halls that echoed with prescribed arguments. The very idea of going outside to test a theory against the evidence of one's own eyes was not just uncommon, it was often considered philosophically unnecessary. Why observe the world when the great minds of antiquity had already explained it all? The tools for such observation were almost non-existent, crude astrolabes and simple quadrants that could barely challenge the grand mathematical models inherited from the past. This was not an age of discovery, but of preservation. It was a world where the map was considered more real than the territory, a continent intellectually adrift, unaware that in the great libraries of the Islamic world and Byzantium, a vast ocean of advanced knowledge was waiting. The profound silence was about to be shattered by a single, unexpected voice. That manuscript was a Latin copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, but to call it merely a translation would be to miss the entire point. Its identity was layered, a palimpsest of intellectual history. The original work, written by Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century, was a monumental Greek treatise mapping the heavens with geometric precision. Yet this specific book, the one that would crash upon Europe's shores, was something far richer. It had undertaken a long and transformative journey eastward before it ever turned west. For centuries, the original Greek text was preserved, studied, and critically improved by Islamic scholars in the great centers of learning like Baghdad and Damascus. They did not just translate Ptolemy's work into Arabic, they engaged with it. They corrected his observational data based on their own meticulous star charts. They refined his mathematical models and appended their own detailed commentaries, creating a living tradition of astronomy that had progressed far beyond its ancient source. This particular copy, likely rendered into Latin in the 12th century in the vibrant, multicultural hubs of Sicily or Spain, was a vessel. It carried not only Ptolemy's cosmic blueprint, but also the accumulated wisdom of Islamic science. Within its pages were superior planetary tables, advanced trigonometric methods, and a more rigorous empirical approach to observing the natural world. Its arrival was not merely the introduction of an old book. It was the sudden, unannounced infusion of a more sophisticated and dynamic scientific tradition into a static intellectual environment. This river of new ideas needed a physical channel to reach Europe, and that channel was forged in places like the Spanish city of Toledo, After Christian forces recaptured the city in the 11th century, they did not find a deserted library but a thriving intellectual metropolis. Within its walls, one of the most extraordinary collaborations in history began to unfold. Christian bishops, eager to access the advanced knowledge held in Arabic texts, sponsored elaborate translation workshops. Here in bustling scriptoriums, a single book would pass through a chain of brilliant minds. A Jewish scholar, fluent in Arabic and the local Romance language, would read the Arabic text aloud. A Mozarabic Christian, bridging the linguistic gap, would then render those words into Castilian Spanish. Finally, a Latinist would translate the Spanish into the formal Latin of the European universities. This was not a silent, solitary act of copying. It was a noisy, dynamic debate, a living conversation across 3 faiths and 3 cultures, all focused on a single goal: unlocking the secrets of the universe contained within books like the Almagest. The manuscript itself was merely the vessel. The real cargo was the intellectual framework it carried, a complete system of thought that European scholars had never before encountered. They were not just reading about planets and stars, they were being handed the sophisticated mathematical tools like trigonometry, needed to calculate their movements with stunning new accuracy. They discovered planetary tables far more precise than any they had ever seen, tables that could predict celestial events with a reliability that seemed almost magical. This was not just new information, it was a new way of thinking. How could the scholarly heart of Europe, so long confined to a closed system of logic and debate, remain unchanged when confronted with such powerful and verifiable knowledge? The map of the world, both the earth and the heavens, was about to be radically redrawn. The sheer predictive power of Ptolemy's celestial machinery was impossible to ignore. In the lecture halls of Oxford and the crowded classrooms of Paris, masters of astronomy who had once taught a simpler, more philosophical universe now stared at complex diagrams of epicycles and deferents. These were the mathematical wheels within wheels that Ptolemy proposed, a system where planets moved in small circles whose centers themselves traveled along larger circles around the Earth. At first glance, it seemed a convoluted and almost absurdly complicated dance. Yet when these scholars used the tables and formulas from the translated Almagest to calculate the future position of Mars or Jupiter, the results were shockingly precise. The old models they had relied upon were vague and often wrong, but this new system worked. It predicted celestial events with a reliability that felt like a form of magic. How could they argue with mathematics that so clearly mirrored the heavens? This created an immediate and profound intellectual schism. On one side was a deep-seated reverence for the established order, a universe governed by divine perfection and philosophical elegance. On the other was an undeniable, calculable truth that did not care for tradition. Some theologians grew uneasy, sensing a threat in this clockwork cosmos. If the movements of the planets were dictated by immutable mathematical laws, where did that leave free will or the direct hand of God? The initial reaction was not a triumphant embrace but a reluctant, grinding acceptance born from sheer evidence. Scholars had to master this new language of trigonometry and geometry, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. To ignore it was to be left behind, to become obsolete in the face of a superior explanation of the world. This was the first hairline fracture in the crystal sphere of medieval thought, a tiny crack through which a flood of new questions would soon pour. So what exactly was inside this manuscript that proved so dangerously compelling? It was not merely a collection of facts about the stars. The Almagest presented a complete intellectual rebellion packaged as a mathematical manual. Its core revolution was a simple, audacious claim. the universe is not a mysterious realm of divine symbols, but a vast physical machine whose movements can be predicted with numerical precision. This was a shift from wondering why the heavens moved to calculating exactly how they would move. Ptolemy did not offer philosophical speculation, he provided geometry. He laid out a system of circles upon circles, known as epicycles and deferents, which could be used to plot the future position of any planet with an accuracy that felt almost like foresight. For a scholar used to allegorical texts, this was like being given the engineering blueprints for creation itself. The book was filled with working tools, not just lofty ideas. It contained a systematic catalogue of over 1,000 stars, each with a carefully measured brightness and position. It introduced the advanced mathematics of spherical trigonometry, a method for solving triangles on the curved surface of the celestial sphere, which was entirely new to European thinkers. This allowed them to move beyond simple observation to genuine calculation. They could now determine the distance between stars, predict eclipses to the hour, and understand the wobble of the Earth's axis. The contrast with their own tradition could not have been starker. Where European natural philosophy asked what a comet meant as a divine sign, the Almagest showed how to track its path through the constellations. One system was qualitative, rooted in symbolism. The other was ruthlessly quantitative, grounded in measurement. This was the manuscript's most explosive gift, the conviction that the cosmos operated by consistent, knowable rules, and that the human mind, armed with mathematics, could decipher them. This single idea would become the bedrock of the entire scientific revolution, waiting only for a spark to set it ablaze. Yet this mathematical precision came with a philosophical price. The cosmos described by Aristotle was a place of serene order, a nest of perfect, transparent spheres that rotated around the Earth with divine harmony. This was a universe built for comfort, where every element had its place and motion followed pure, logical principles. Ptolemy's models shattered that crystalline perfection. To make his predictions work with such stunning accuracy, he had to introduce strange devices called eccentrics and equants. An eccentric was a circle whose center was slightly offset from the Earth. An equant was an even more peculiar idea, a point in space from which a planet's motion would appear uniform, even though it was not orbiting that point. Think of it like this: if Aristotle's universe was a perfect, centered wheel, Ptolemy's was a wheel that was not only off-center, but also appeared to spin at a steady speed only when viewed from a specific, awkward vantage point that was not its true center. This was a direct violation of the core Aristotelian rule that all heavenly motion must be perfectly circular and perfectly centered on our world. Suddenly, the most accurate map of the heavens ever created was built on a foundation that seemed physically impossible and philosophically offensive. How could the heavens, the realm of God, be so geometrically messy? European scholars were caught in an impossible bind. To accept Ptolemy's math was to reject Aristotle's physics. To cling to Aristotle's beautiful spheres was to ignore a predictive model that actually worked. This was no longer a simple debate about data. It was a fundamental crisis of belief. The pursuit of truth was forcing a painful choice between a comforting lie and an ugly, inconvenient fact. The resolution of this tension would not come from a single answer, but from the very act of questioning it unleashed. So the manuscript itself was merely the seed, but it needed fertile ground to grow. Consider the work of Gerard of Cremona, a scholar from Italy who traveled to Toledo with one burning goal: to find Ptolemy's Almagest. When he finally held an Arabic copy in his hands, his task was not to create a simple word-for-word substitution. He was embarking on an act of intellectual archaeology, digging through layers of meaning to unearth the core principles. His translation became a bridge, but his commentary built the guardrails. He did not just give Europe the text, he gave them a guided tour. In the margins and in separate volumes, he and others like him would write extensive explanations. They would point to a particularly dense passage on planetary motion and say, "Here is the difficulty." They would note where Ptolemy's predictions did not quite match what they observed in the night sky, suggesting small corrections. They compared his geometric models with ideas from other Arabic texts, creating a conversation across centuries. This was the birth of a scholarly ecosystem. The raw Almagest was a monologue, a brilliant but frozen lecture from the past. The translated and commented version was a dialogue. It invited the reader not to blindly accept, but to question, to test, to improve. This critical engagement transformed a sacred text into a working document, full of annotations and proposed amendments. It taught European scholars a new and radical habit, the habit of treating authority not as the final word, but as the first word in an ongoing investigation. That shift from reverence to critique was the true spark. The manuscript provided the map, but the commentators taught them how to read it, and more importantly, how to correct it when they found it was wrong. The drive to match Ptolemy's mathematical precision could not be satisfied with old tools. European astronomers, their curiosity ignited by the translated manuscript, looked at their simple wooden quadrants and astrolabes and found them wanting. These were the instruments of an older, more qualitative age, good for telling time or finding the direction of Mecca, but not for the rigorous demands of the Almagest. To truly test Ptolemy's star catalogue or his complex models of planetary motion, they needed instruments of breathtaking accuracy. A quiet revolution in craftsmanship began. Artisans working closely with scholars started forging metal astrolabes of unprecedented size and complexity. These were not pocket-sized devices, but large, finely engraved discs of brass, their delicate retearwork casting intricate shadows that could pinpoint a star's altitude to a fraction of a degree. In university courtyards and royal gardens, you would now find massive armillary spheres, skeletal models of the cosmos made from nested bronze rings. Each ring represented a celestial circle, an equator, an ecliptic, or a meridian, allowing an observer to directly measure the coordinates of any celestial body against this three-dimensional map of the heavens. This was no longer passive observation, it was active, targeted measurement. The manuscript had given them a standard, a set of numbers to aim for, and they were building the machines to hit that target. This new pursuit of precision demanded more than just better tools. It demanded a new kind of place for knowledge, a dedicated space for the long, patient work of watching the sky. The first true European observatories began to take shape, not as grand domes yet, but as sturdy towers where these new instruments could be permanently mounted, safe from the wind and vibration, pointing steadily at the stars night after night, year after year. Here, astronomers started the monumental task of creating their own star catalogues, not from copying old books, but from direct, painstaking measurement. They would train their sights on a known star, record its position using the graduated scales of their armillary sphere, and then turn to the corresponding entry in the Almagest. For the first time, they were comparing the ancient text not against other texts, but against the cold, hard reality of the night. At first, the results were a triumph for Ptolemy. His predictions held up with an accuracy that must have felt supernatural. But as the years of observation accumulated, a troubling pattern emerged. The positions of certain stars had shifted, just slightly, from where the ancient master had placed them. The planets, over decades, were slowly drifting from their predicted paths. The very act of verifying the manuscript was beginning to reveal its flaws. The quest for accuracy, sparked by a blind faith in an ancient authority, had created a feedback loop of critique. The tools built to confirm the system were now gathering the data that would, centuries later, help to break it. How long could the perfect mathematical universe withstand the weight of its own tiny, accumulating errors? The mathematical language of the Almagest was a code that had to be cracked. To truly command its predictive power, European scholars could not simply read the text, they had to think in its terms. This meant mastering an entirely new form of mathematics, one built on the sine function and the laws of spherical trigonometry. These were not just new names for old ideas. The sine was a revolutionary concept, a precise way to relate the angles of a triangle to the lengths of its sides, and it was the fundamental engine driving every calculation in Ptolemy's cosmic model. For a scholar trained only in the rudimentary geometry of Euclid, this was like a musician who only knew a simple scale being handed a complex symphony and told to perform it. The very tools needed to understand the manuscript were embedded within the intellectual tradition that had preserved and improved it. The Almagest, therefore, acted as a brilliant Trojan horse. Its primary gift appeared to be a map of the heavens, but its hidden cargo was the sophisticated mathematical toolkit required to read that map, a toolkit that would become the foundation for every major scientific advance to come. The sudden, urgent need to calculate planetary positions created an insatiable demand for mathematical literacy. Masters at universities who had once focused on logic and rhetoric now found themselves compelled to teach the abstract principles of trigonometry. This was not an abstract academic exercise. A student's ability to predict an eclipse or plot the retrograde motion of Mars depended directly on his skill with a sine table. This practical demand sparked a creative explosion. European mathematicians, no longer mere students of ancient texts, began composing their own original treatises on trigonometry and geometry, written in Latin for a new generation of scholars. They built upon the Islamic foundation, refining the methods and expanding their applications. The study of mathematics was transformed almost overnight from a peripheral philosophical pursuit into a central, vital science, all because a single manuscript made it the key to unlocking the universe. The University of Bologna as lecture halls became a crucible for this new way of thinking. As one of the first institutions to formally adopt the Almagest into its curriculum, the university witnessed a profound shift in its intellectual life. Astronomy was no longer a quiet corner of natural philosophy, a subject for abstract debate about the nature of the celestial spheres. It was now a demanding mathematical science. Professors like Johannes de Sacrobosco did not simply teach from the ancient manuscript, they built upon it. His own textbook, A Work on the Sphere, distilled the core concepts of Ptolemaic astronomy for a European audience, becoming a standard text copied and read across the continent for centuries. This was the ripple effect in action, a single manuscript generating waves of new scholarship. The student experience was transformed. A young scholar arriving in Bologna to study the liberal arts would now find himself confronted with complex trigonometric calculations and the intricate mechanics of epicycles. His education required more than memorizing authoritative statements. It demanded he engage with the numbers themselves. He had to learn to predict a planet's path, to work through the geometric proofs, to understand the universe not as a story, but as a system of equations. This daily practice of quantitative analysis trained an entire generation to think in terms of measurable, verifiable facts. The questions being asked in the courtyards and classrooms began to change. It was no longer enough to ask what Aristotle meant. The pressing question became, is Aristotle right? Does the model match what we see in the sky tonight? This environment of rigorous calculation naturally bred a spirit of critical inquiry. When a student's own computations revealed a tiny discrepancy between the tables and his observation, he was experiencing a moment of profound intellectual empowerment. He was learning that even the greatest authority could be questioned, and that the final arbiter of truth was not a dusty book, but the consistent, testable behavior of the natural world. Bologna became a factory for a new type of mind, one equipped with the tools and the confidence to eventually dismantle the very cosmic system it was first taught to master. The manuscript's ultimate power was not in the answers it gave, but in the questions it forced its readers to ask. For the first time, scholars held a text whose authority was derived not from its age or its author, but from its demonstrable, calculable performance. It created a new and deeply unsettling yardstick for truth, predictive power. The established intellectual tradition was built on a foundation of octoritas, where the word of an ancient master like Aristotle was the final argument in any debate. But how could you argue with a set of tables that told you exactly when the moon would eclipse the sun, or where Mars would appear in the sky 6 months from now? The Almagest shifted the entire burden of proof. It was no longer enough to simply cite an ancient text. The model itself had to work. This forced a subtle but monumental change in the scholar's mindset. The primary question evolved from "what did the authorities say?" to "does this match what we observe?" This was the birth of a critical, testing mentality. A master teaching from the Almagest would inevitably find himself pointing out its minor flaws, the small discrepancies between its predictions and the latest observations made with those new, precise instruments. In doing so, he was performing a revolutionary act. He was demonstrating that even the greatest of authorities could be wrong, and that the path to better knowledge was through careful measurement and honest critique. The manuscript became a living participant in a debate, not a monument to be worshipped. It taught an entire generation that the goal of study was not blind acceptance, but active verification. This habit of subjecting every idea to the cold light of evidence is the very soul of the scientific method. By making scholars into critics, the Almagest did more than just map the stars. It charted a new course for the human mind itself. But how did the guardians of the old world respond to this mechanical universe? The arrival of the Almagest did not trigger an immediate war between science and faith. Instead, it initiated a long and complex negotiation. Some within the church viewed the new cosmology with deep suspicion. A universe governed by immutable mathematical laws, a cosmic clockwork that could predict a planet's position centuries in advance, seemed to leave little room for divine providence or miracles. Where was God's direct hand in a system that appeared to run on its own? The most philosophically offensive element was Ptolemy's equant, that strange point from which a planet's motion appeared uniform. This was not just a mathematical trick. To its critics, it implied that the heavens obeyed a kind of abstract geometry rather than a physical, God-given law of perfect circular motion. It felt like a violation of celestial perfection, yet the church's reaction was far from a unified rejection. In fact, many of the most brilliant minds within the church saw an opportunity. The great scholastic theologian Thomas Aquinas embarked on a monumental project to synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, and into this grand synthesis, he and others carefully wove the framework of Ptolemaic astronomy. They argued that this mathematical order was not a challenge to God, but a magnificent reflection of his divine intellect. The predictable movements of the planets were not evidence of an absent creator, but of a supremely rational one who had established elegant, knowable laws for his creation. The clockwork universe became God's perfect clock. This was a crucial turning point. By being absorbed into mainstream theology, the Almagest's cosmology gained a powerful shield of legitimacy. It was no longer a dangerous foreign idea, but a respected part of the intellectual landscape. This complex dialogue between faith and a newly emerging reason defined the era. The path to acceptance was not a simple story of conflict, but a nuanced dance of adaptation and integration, proving that even the most revolutionary ideas must often find a way to speak the language of the world they hope to change. This celestial mathematics did not remain confined to academic debate. It soon found its most urgent application on the rolling decks of ships crossing uncharted oceans. The same principles of spherical astronomy that allowed a scholar in Bologna to calculate a planet's path now gave a Portuguese navigator the power to know his place on the globe. The star charts and trigonometric tables derived from the Almagest became lifelines for explorers. Before this knowledge spread, navigating the open sea was a terrifying gamble. Sailors clung to coastlines, navigating by landmarks and dead reckoning, a crude method of guessing their position based on speed and direction. Venturing into the deep Atlantic or south along the African coast meant risking disappearance into a trackless void. But with the new tools, a navigator could wait for nightfall, raise his polished astrolabe to measure the angle of the North Star above the horizon, and calculate his latitude. This single number, his distance north or south of the equator, was a thread of certainty in an immense and featureless wilderness. It was a coordinate pulled directly from the heavens, a gift from Ptolemy's ancient star catalogue. This was not abstract science, it was a survival technology. The quest to understand the cosmos was now directly enabling the exploration of the Earth. A captain like Vasco da Gama, pushing down the coast of Africa, relied on astronomical tables that were the intellectual descendants of that single manuscript. Each time he fixed his position by the stars, he was proving a profound new truth, that the universe was knowable, and that this knowledge granted real power over the physical world. The economic and geographic expansion of Europe, the race for spices and empires, was being guided by a map of the stars written centuries before. How far could this new confidence in human calculation ultimately take them? The answer lay over the horizon, waiting to be discovered. Yet for all its influence, a hand-copied manuscript remained a prisoner of its own scarcity. A single copy of the Almagest represented a fortune in time and labor, chaining its revolutionary ideas to the shelves of a handful of wealthy monasteries or universities. This bottleneck of knowledge shattered in the mid-15th century with the invention of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's system of movable type did not just make books easier to produce, it fundamentally altered the ecology of ideas. Where a scribe might take a year to produce one flawless copy, a printing press could now create hundreds of identical texts in a matter of weeks. This was the force multiplier that the Almagest's ideas desperately needed. In 1515, the first printed edition of Ptolemy's masterpiece rolled off the presses in Venice. Suddenly, this foundational text was no longer a rare treasure to be whispered about. It became a commodity, a book that could be purchased by a growing class of urban merchants, curious physicians, and university students far from the great intellectual capitals. The very nature of scholarship transformed. A student in Krakow and a master in Paris could now hold the exact same words, the same numerical tables, and the same geometric diagrams in their hands. This fidelity was revolutionary. It eliminated the creeping errors of generations of copyists, ensuring that everyone was debating the same precise information. Critical engagement with the cosmos was no longer a privilege for the few. It became a public, continent-wide conversation. Amateur astronomers in their own homes could now check Ptolemy's star positions against the night sky, their findings able to be shared and compared with others through identical printed copies. The slow, careful accumulation of minor corrections and new observations, once the work of centuries, could now accelerate into a single lifetime. The printing press did not just spread the Almagest's ideas, it weaponized them, turning a single spark of critique into a firestorm of innovation that would soon consume the very universe it described. Nicolaus Copernicus was a product of the very tradition he would one day overturn. As a young scholar, he immersed himself in the Ptolemaic system, not as a passive student, but as a master of its intricate mathematics. He learned to calculate planetary positions using the complex machinery of epicycles and deferents, and in doing so, he felt the system's profound weaknesses firsthand. For all its predictive power, the model was a labyrinth of circles, a celestial clockwork so convoluted that it seemed to violate the very principle of cosmic harmony it claimed to represent. Copernicus absorbed the centuries of commentary that had grown around the Almagest, the marginal notes and separate treatises where generations of astronomers had pointed out the same persistent flaws. The equant, that awkward point from which motion appeared uniform, was a particular offense. It was a mathematical fiction that made the calculations work, but it broke the philosophical rule of perfect, centered circular motion. Why would the universe be built on such an inelegant foundation? This question gnawed at him. His great insight did not come from discarding Ptolemy, but from taking the tools Ptolemy had provided and asking a more radical question. What if the entire frame of reference was wrong? What if the sun, and not the earth, was the center of this dance? The mathematics he used to build his new, sun-centered model was the same trigonometry the Almagest had introduced to Europe. His revolutionary system was, in a profound sense, the final and most brilliant commentary ever written on the ancient text. He was using the master's own tools to dismantle the master's house, proving that the manuscript's ultimate legacy was not a perfect answer, but the permission to ask a better question. The same hunger for original knowledge that drove astronomers to Ptolemy began to reshape the very study of life itself. Physicians and scholars, inspired by the success of this celestial revival, turned their attention to the ancient masters of medicine, Galen and Hippocrates. They realized that the medical texts they had been using were also faded copies of copies, filtered through centuries of commentary and misunderstanding. A new generation of doctors, armed with the same spirit of empirical inquiry that the Almagest had championed, demanded to read the originals. They sought out Greek and Arabic manuscripts, commissioning fresh Latin translations that captured the precise observations of the ancient healers. This was not merely an academic exercise, it created a profound intellectual dissonance. A physician reading Galen's detailed descriptions of muscles and bones would look at the crude, schematic diagrams in his own textbook and see a glaring mismatch. The text described a complex, interlocking machine, but the pictures showed a crude puppet. How could they trust the medicine if they did not truly understand the body it was meant to heal? This critical mindset, sharpened in the astronomical debates over planetary models, was now applied to the human form. The authority of Galen, like that of Ptolemy, was about to be tested against direct evidence. This led to a momentous and startling development, the formal introduction of human dissection into the university curriculum. In candlelit anatomy theaters, a barber surgeon would carefully open a cadaver while a professor, high above, read aloud from the works of Galen. The goal was not to challenge the ancient master, but to confirm his wisdom, to see his descriptions made flesh. Yet, just as with the stars, the act of looking closely began to reveal discrepancies. The muscles and organs they saw did not always match the words in the book. The very process designed to reinforce authority was instead training these physicians to trust their own eyes over any text. This was the essential preparation, the slow cultivation of a new kind of courage that would enable a man like Andreas Vesalius to step forward and declare that the ancient maps of the human body, revered for over 1,000 years, were simply wrong. This new hunger for celestial knowledge could not run on intellect alone. It needed gold. The sophisticated astronomy flowing from manuscripts like the Almagest quickly revealed its immense practical value, attracting the attention of Europe's most powerful patrons. Kings and popes, merchants and nobles, they all began to see the wisdom in funding a brilliant mathematician. For the Church, the most immediate need was an accurate calendar. The dating of Easter and other movable feasts was a perennial problem, as the existing Julian calendar had slowly drifted out of sync with the solar year. A scholar who could apply Ptolemaic mathematics to recalibrate the calendar was not just an academic, he was a servant of God, ensuring the holiest days were celebrated at their proper time. Meanwhile, merchant princes in cities like Venice and Lisbon understood that better navigation meant safer, faster trade routes and immense profit. Funding an astronomer to produce more precise planetary tables or star charts was not philanthropy, it was a strategic investment in their commercial empires. And for the nobility, the ancient art of astrology remained a powerful lure. A patron would gladly provide a lifelong pension to a scholar if it meant receiving personalized horoscopes that could guide political decisions or predict the fate of a dynasty. This system of patronage created a new class of professional intellectual. For the first time, a man could make a living not as a monk or a university master bound to a rigid curriculum, but as a dedicated researcher funded by a patron to pursue his studies full-time. This economic engine, first cranked into motion by the demand for Ptolemaic science, would eventually sustain the great observers like Tycho Brahe in his castle, funded by the King of Denmark, and the mathematical genius of Johannes Kepler working for Emperor Rudolf II. Knowledge had become a tangible asset, a form of power that the wealthy and influential were eager to buy. The lone scholar in his study was now a sought-after expert, his mind a resource as valuable as any fleet of ships or chest of silver. Yet the Almagest did not sail into a vacuum. It was the flagship of a vast and silent fleet, an entire armada of knowledge crossing from the east. Alongside Ptolemy's celestial maps came other revolutionary texts, each one a key to a different kingdom of understanding. From the east arrived Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, a monumental encyclopedia that systematized all known medical knowledge. It offered physicians a logical framework for diagnosis and treatment, blending the theories of Galen with its own clinical insights, and it would dominate the teaching of medicine in European universities for centuries. At almost the same time, scholars encountered Alhazen's Book of Optics, a work that fundamentally challenged how people saw, quite literally, the nature of light and vision. Alhazen did not rely on abstract speculation. He built a camera obscura, he experimented with lenses, and he demonstrated through methodical testing that vision occurs when light rays enter the eye, not when the eye emits some kind of visual force as the ancients had believed. This was a masterclass in experimental science, arriving centuries before the official scientific revolution. And then there was the work of Al-Khwarizmi, whose name itself would give us the word algorithm. His comprehensive book on algebra introduced Europe to systematic solving of equations, a mathematical toolkit that was as essential for building a merchant's account ledger as it was for calculating the motion of a planet. Each of these books was a world in itself. The canon gave them a new body, the Book of Optics gave them new eyes, and algebra gave them a new language for calculation. So when we place the Almagest back into this bustling port of incoming ideas, its role becomes even clearer. It was not a lone miracle. It was the most dazzling vessel in a convoy that brought a complete intellectual operating system. The scientific renaissance was not ignited by a single, solitary spark. It was lit by a constellation of brilliant fires, each one illuminating a different part of the natural world, and together they banished the darkness all at once. This geometric view of the cosmos did not stay confined to the stars. It began to reshape how artists saw the very world before their eyes. In the workshops of Florence, a revolution was unfolding on wooden panels and plaster walls, one that owed a silent debt to the mathematical spirit of the Almagest. The problem painters faced was a flat one. How could they represent a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface in a way that felt real, that made a viewer feel they could step into the scene? The old methods used hierarchical scaling, where important figures were simply painted larger, or intuitive angles that never quite added up. The result was a world that looked symbolic but never truly alive. Then came Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect of Florence's great cathedral dome. He performed a stunning public demonstration, creating a painted panel of the baptistry that, when viewed through a peephole from the correct spot, merged perfectly with the real building. His secret was not just artistic genius, but geometric precision. He had used a single vanishing point and orthogonals, lines all converging to that point, to mathematically construct the illusion of depth. Leon Battista Alberti later codified this method in his treatise on painting, giving artists a set of rules as reliable as an astronomical table. He described the picture plane as an open window, and the artist's task was to trace the pyramid of light entering that window. This was not just a new technique, it was a new philosophy of sight. The same intellectual current that sought to map the heavens with triangles and circles was now being used to map a street, a room, or a human face. An artist preparing his panel would first lay down a grid of lines, a geometric scaffold invisible in the final work but essential to its truth. He was, in effect, creating a coordinate system for the visible world, just as an astronomer laid a coordinate system over the celestial sphere. The pursuit of cosmic order had found its earthly expression. A painting was no longer a mere decoration. It was a demonstration of universal laws, a proof that the same rational principles governed both the heavens and the human realm. How far could this new vision of a measurable, orderly world ultimately take them? A single hand-copied manuscript was a fragile thing, a snowflake of knowledge, unique and prone to melting away. The earliest Latin versions of the Almagest were transcribed in monastic scriptoriums by scribes who may not have understood the complex mathematics they were inking onto precious parchment. A moment of tiredness, a misheard word in a multilingual translation workshop, or a simple slip of the pen could introduce a tiny, catastrophic error into a planetary table. One wrong number, copied over and over again for generations, could throw off the predicted position of Jupiter by a degree, rendering the entire system unreliable. Each copy was an individual, bearing not only the text but also the accumulated fingerprints of every scribe who had handled it. For centuries, this was simply how knowledge traveled, slowly accumulating variations like a story told in a long game of telephone. The authority of the book was one thing, but the physical reality of any single copy was often a flawed and imperfect shadow of the original. How could you trust the cosmos when you could not even trust the book in your hands? This inherent fragility sparked its own revolution, not in the stars, but in the very way scholars handled texts. A new, painstaking discipline emerged known as critical editing. A scholar would embark on a quest, gathering as many different manuscript copies of the Almagest as he could find, perhaps from a monastery library in Paris, a cathedral school in Cologne, and a private collection in Bologna. He would then lay them out side by side, comparing them line by line, number by number. His goal was not to pick one and declare it the winner, but to act as a literary detective, searching for the original reading that made the most mathematical and logical sense. Where one manuscript had a 7 and another had a 1, he would consult his own astronomical observations to see which digit produced the correct planetary position. This was scholarship as forensic science, a meticulous process of sifting through the noise of human error to recover a pure signal from the past. The creation of a critical edition was more than just proofreading. It was an act of reconstruction, a declaration that truth could be triangulated from multiple, flawed sources. This obsessive concern for textual accuracy reflected a profound shift in mentality. The focus was moving from the author's name on the page to the verifiable evidence within it. The journey of the Almagest from a unique, error-prone codex to a standardized, printed critical edition perfectly mirrors the broader intellectual journey of the age, a slow but decisive turn away from the uncritical acceptance of authority and toward a rigorous, evidence-based approach to all knowledge, whether found in a book or written in the stars. Yet it is vital to recognize what this manuscript did not do. The Almagest did not instantly shatter the medieval worldview, nor did it argue for a sun-centered universe. In fact, its entire system was built upon the very idea of an Earth fixed at the center of all creation. For more than 3 centuries after its arrival, European astronomers revered Ptolemy's work as the ultimate achievement in celestial science, not as a flawed idea to be discarded. They saw it as the solution, not the problem. This single book did not single-handedly cause the Renaissance. It was one brilliant thread in a vast tapestry of change, woven alongside rediscovered art, growing trade, and new political structures. Its true revolution was quieter, more subtle, and ultimately more powerful. The Almagest's greatest gift was not a new map of the heavens, but a new way of thinking about the map itself. It handed European scholars the precise tools and the reliable data to measure the cosmos for the first time. In doing so, it trained them to trust calculation over pure authority. It prepared the ground by making the mind itself more rigorous, more critical, and more confident. These thinkers were like apprentices given a master's perfect set of chisels and rules. They spent generations learning to carve with them, mastering the craft by reproducing the master's work. Only after they had achieved that mastery, only after they knew the tools and the materials intimately, could they finally look at the master's design, see its subtle flaws, and feel equipped to draft a better one. The path from the Almagest to Copernicus was not a sudden leap, but a long apprenticeship in precision and critique. The manuscript did not provide the final answer. It taught them how to ask the right questions and gave them the courage to believe they could find the answers for themselves. This understanding saves us from a simple story of one book changing everything, and instead reveals the beautiful, complex truth of how knowledge truly grows, not in sudden explosions, but in the patient, collective work of countless minds building upon a foundation they eventually learn to transcend. The true legacy of the Almagest is not found in any single calculation or corrected star chart. Its most profound power was symbolic, a quiet echo that resonates far beyond the realm of astronomy. This manuscript stands as a permanent monument to a radical idea that human knowledge is not the property of any one culture or era. It is a collaborative project, a fragile flame passed from hand to hand across the centuries. The journey of this single book drew an unbroken line from the scholars of ancient Alexandria to the brilliant translators of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, to the multilingual workshops of Toledo, and finally into the lecture halls of Paris and Bologna. It proved that intellectual progress is a cumulative enterprise, where each generation builds upon the discoveries of the last, and where great leaps forward often begin with the rediscovery of a lost wisdom. The story of the Almagest is a powerful lesson in intellectual humility. It reminds us that a civilization at its peak must have the courage to look beyond its own borders, to learn from traditions it might otherwise dismiss. Medieval Europe, for all its insularity, was ultimately transformed because it was willing to receive this gift from the Islamic world, to translate it, to critique it, and to make that foreign knowledge its own. In our own age of digital information overload, where data is abundant but wisdom can feel scarce, the journey of this manuscript serves as a vital parable. It speaks to the shocking fragility of knowledge, how a single work of genius can be nearly erased by time, preserved only through the dedicated efforts of countless, often nameless, scribes and scholars. Yet it also testifies to knowledge's incredible resilience, its ability to slumber for centuries in a dusty library before awakening to ignite a revolution. The Almagest symbolizes the profound truth that a single book, a mere collection of ideas inscribed on fragile pages, can quietly alter the trajectory of our entire civilization. That same mathematical modeling, first perfected for the stars, became the bedrock of theoretical physics. The equations that once charted the path of Venus were adapted by Isaac Newton to describe the force of gravity itself. He took the language of celestial motion and applied it to a falling apple, unifying the heavens and the earth under a single set of mathematical laws. This was the ultimate fulfillment of the Almagest's promise, the conviction that the entire universe operates by consistent, knowable rules that can be captured in numbers and symbols. The very idea that a physical reality can be represented by an abstract equation is a direct inheritance from that ancient manuscript. Its emphasis on precise, quantifiable observation forged the foundation of the experimental method. The long, patient nights spent verifying star positions trained a mindset that would later be used in a different kind of laboratory. When a chemist carefully weighs reagents or a biologist counts cell divisions, they are performing the same essential act as those medieval astronomers, trusting measurement over intuition. The entire scientific process, that critical dialogue between theory and evidence, was rehearsed for centuries in the margins of the Almagest. Scholars would propose a small adjustment to an epicycle to account for a new observation, then test that adjustment against the next planetary cycle. This continuous loop of prediction, observation, and refinement is the engine of modern science. Even the tools of its own demolition were part of its legacy. The telescopes Galileo trained on Jupiter's moons were not a sudden invention. They were the technological grandchildren of the precise instruments built to serve the Ptolemaic tradition, the astrolabes and quadrants that first taught Europeans the discipline of accurate measurement. The manuscript created a culture of looking closely, a culture that would eventually build better eyes to see with. So this single book did far more than ignite a renaissance of old knowledge. It helped codify the core principles of the entire modern scientific worldview, principles we still rely on to probe the deepest mysteries of the cosmos, from the quantum realm to the edges of the observable universe. This story of a single manuscript is far more than a historical footnote. It is a profound lesson in how knowledge truly moves through the world, not in a straight line, but in a fragile, unpredictable relay across cultures and centuries. From its creation in the brilliant mind of Ptolemy in ancient Alexandria, to its careful preservation and enhancement by scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, to its explosive arrival in the lecture halls of medieval Europe, the Almagest demonstrates the vital, collaborative nature of intellectual progress. This journey was not guaranteed. It relied on the dedication of countless translators, scribes, and patrons who saw value in a wisdom not their own. The book itself was the vessel, but its true cargo was a new way of thinking. It taught a continent to measure the heavens with precision, to question ancient authority with confidence, and to place its trust in the universal language of mathematics. That legacy is written in the stars observed by Copernicus, in the revolutionary equations of Newton, and in the very spirit of inquiry that continues to drive science forward today. As we navigate our own complex age of information and discovery, this ancient manuscript's journey challenges us. It asks us to be both preservers and courageous critics, to seek out transformative ideas from every source, and to engage with them not with fear, but with the conviction that understanding the world is our most human endeavor. If this journey through the history of science resonated with you, subscribe for more explorations into the moments that shaped our world. We would love to hear your thoughts on this pivotal manuscript in the comments below.